So, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming on this rainy night to hear this. I usually like to speak a lot in the talks, but because I have 1 hour and I really have to hold to that 1 hour, I'm going to start by reading quite a bit, and then I'll move into the stories where I can be a little more relaxed. So, I'm going to begin now. The talk is called The Trackless One, Buddhist Guide to Freedom. And the subject of the talk, The Trackless One, is a description of the Buddha, one of many, many descriptions that the Buddha has been given, many titles that he's been given. And this one is special because it has this sense of freedom and liberation and even adventure to it when you think of the trackless one. It describes a state of being traceless, not findable, not to be defined or held down in any form, and to be free of the normal constraints of the conditional world. There's a lightness to being trackless, as if you're not subject to the laws of gravity, as if you're a bit above the ground. And there's something invisible about being trackless. It's a presence. The being is present because the trackless one is there, but you can't see the trackless one. The trackless one is part of another world, not the material world. So now I'm going to read these 2 verses before I tell you about where they come from and details about them. So there are 2 specific verses. And the enlightened one that it speaks of is the Buddha. That enlightened one whose sphere is endless, whose victory is irreversible, and after whose victory no defilements remain to be conquered. By what track will you lead him astray, the trackless one? That enlightened one in whom there is not that ensnaring, entangling, craving to lead anywhere in conditioned existence, and whose sphere is endless. By what track will you lead him astray, the trackless one? So, these verses of the Buddha are found in a small text called the Dhammapada. And Dhamma means truth or reality, and pada means a footstep or a path or a way. So it can be translated as the way of truth. The text comes from the Sutta section of the Pali Canon from the 1st century BCC, and Sutta means a thread of teaching. It has 423 verses, and the verses are just between 3 and 5 lines each, in 26 chapters, and each chapter has just a slightly different angle on looking at the spiritual teaching, so that it all forms together a guide to spiritual development. And the Dhammapada is one of the best loved and most well-known writings in the Buddhist literature. It was first translated in 1855 in Latin, and then there have been countless versions over and over again in many, many different languages. And the one that I'm using is by Sangharakshita, who is an old teacher and writer, who is also the founder of the Triratna order to which I belong. I'm a mitra, or a friend of that order, and I study the Dharma, or the teachings of reality. And Sangharakshita died last year at the age of 93. And when he chose to do this book, it was published in 2001. There were already 30 translations in English of the Dhammapada, but he wanted to do it because he wanted to show the sense of urgency that he felt the Pali, the original Pali text had. And a sense of urgency is that feeling of, let's do it now, let's get on with it now, I've got to do it now. And he wanted to give that feeling of urgency that he felt wasn't there in the other translations. And I'll just read one verse that gives that feeling a little bit. Get up, don't be heedless, live practicing the Dhamma. The Dhamma, which is good conduct. One who lives practicing the Dhamma dwells happily, both in this world and the other. Now, the other world isn't heaven. It's a world that is not conditioned. It's not the material world in time and space. That's all that means. Okay, so I'm going to let you know what I'm doing now in this talk. It's going to be in 4 parts. Firstly, I want to look generally at the Dhammapada, at its characteristics and its context. Then secondly, I'm going to read the trackless verses again and discuss some of the meanings in Pali and English of the words in the verses. And at that time, I want to look at what it means to have tracks in your life, both personally and globally. And then thirdly, I want to look at some stories from the Buddha's life and the story of his becoming trackless. Then fourthly, I will pull out some qualities that could help us to move closer to this kind of freedom in our own lives. So firstly, let's look generally at the text and imagery of the Dhammapada. Many verses have images that come directly from nature and evoke the very early times of agriculture on earth in the late 5th century BCC, when the Buddha was traveling through the countryside of northern India and Nepal, and he was speaking and teaching and living in the forest, the great forests around the Ganges River, the Gange, which had not yet been totally cut down. It was still a kind of fresh new world that didn't have the systems and infrastructure on it that we have covering our world. But at the same time, it was a time of war and a time of strife. And he saw a lot of this, and his teachings carry a lot of the suffering and impermanence that was around him. And I'm going to read now a couple more verses from the Dhammapada that show that a little bit. Like a frontier city, well guarded within and without, so guard yourself. Let not the fortunate moment of human birth pass you by. Those who allow the fortunate moment to pass by grieve when they go to the woeful state. And there's another. Not in the sky, nor in the midst of the sea, nor yet in the clefts of mountains. Nowhere in the world, in fact, is there any place to be found where, having entered, one will not be overcome by death. So we don't know if these verses were actually the Buddha's, because they were repeated by oral transmission over several hundred years. But the text of the Dhammapada was translated also in other languages, in Sanskrit, this one in Pali, in Prakrit, and in Tibetan. And all of these translations have some verses that are exactly identical and the same. So we know that they all came from an earlier version or versions. We do know that. Many of the images contain strong physicality of animals, plants, and humans, with their tools and the simple technology of their lives. The book describes the processes of nature and the natural elements of stone, water, earth, lots of mud, lots of dust, air, sky, fire, little lamps lit and blazing fires, and the soft light of the moon as metaphors for spiritual development. And I'll read you a few verses that kind of show those elements as well. A solid rock cannot be shaken by the wind, so the spiritually mature person is unmoved by praise or blame. Irrigators draw off the water, fletchers straighten arrows, carpenters shape wood, righteous men discipline themselves. One who, having formerly been heedless, later is not heedless, lights up the world like the moon when freed from clouds. Sangharakshita describes this text as a book which is a source of inspiration, and I think that's really a good description, because it really brings us to life when we read it. It brings out a willingness to take on Buddhist practices of meditation and mindfulness and ethical awareness and insight into reality and compassion for all beings. It asks us continually to question ourselves about the way we live and to look at the result of our actions. And that's the law of karma. Karma simply means action. It doesn't have anything to do with fate or destiny. It's just action. And every action we make has an effect. And it is through the effects of our actions that we learn how to direct our lives toward spiritual development. The book emphasizes our freedom to choose to act in ways that will have positive effects. It is continually mentioned that this is not easy. It is hard to change the patterns of our lives, but when we do, there is great happiness. And I've got some verses to read to you. The first two are about one action, the karmic effects of one action. And the second two are about actions growing together to create a habit or a track. That deed is not well done, which being done, one repents, and the result of which one suffers with tearful face and lamentations. That deed is well done, which being done, one does not repent, and the result of which one receives gladly. Should a man once do evil, let him not make a habit of it. Let him not set his heart on it. Painful is the heaping up of evil. Should a man once do good, let him make a habit of it. Let him set his heart on it. Happy is the heaping up of good. The book continually shows the positive and negative effects of karma. It takes us on this up and down journey from the pain and suffering that is caused by unskillful action, and the delight and the joy of skillful actions and a life of mindfulness and clarity. So this up and down momentum shows the rhythm of our human life, when things work out and go well for us, and then they don't, and they result in pain and suffering, and then happiness and joy comes back. So there is that up and downness of life. The trackless verses appear in the middle of this text, which has this momentum, and it continues with the momentum. But the trackless verses appear in the middle, and they give another possibility from this up and down world. It's a kind of rising up or a flying free that goes beyond this positive and negative rhythm of the vices and virtues of life that is shown throughout the book. After the trackless verses are first brought in, then the trackless image is mentioned several times throughout the text and always brings this feeling of another reality that is light and free. So now, secondly, we're going to look more deeply at the trackless verses themselves. I will read one and discuss it, and then read the next. So I'll reread that first one. That enlightened one whose sphere is endless, whose victory is irreversible, and after whose victory no defilements remain to be conquered. By what track will you lead him astray? The trackless one. So trackless is apada, which means without footprints. And so footprints and tracks in the Dhammapada have this special quality, a kind of heaviness of the effect of our actions. And the very first verse in the book brings this very strongly out, the effect of a footprint. And it says, experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and preceded by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cart wheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. So the ox is pushing his hoof into the soil, and he's pulling this heavy cart, And the heavy cart is the suffering that's coming from this unskillful action, the results of acting in an unskillful way. And the second verse says the opposite. It says that when acting with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. And that's interesting because the shadow is very light. It doesn't weigh us down. But it's also us. We and the shadow aren't different. Every time the sun touches you, your shadow is there. So this essential skillfulness is in us, where the suffering is actually something added on that we're pulling along with us. The next phrase is that this enlightened one, whose sphere is endless, and that is anatta gojaram, which means beyond where the cow goes. And so this is beyond the fenced or bounded territory. It's a place. This trackless one is somewhere else than the place that we have our life of usefulness and we make our living. And it's beyond the limits of conditioned being. And it reminds me of the Rumi poem about right and wrong, where he says, there is a field beyond right and wrong. I'll meet you there. So it's another place away from the kind of dualism and the binary sort of judgments of our own world. The second phrase about the enlightened one is, whose victory is irreversible. So Buddha does not come back ever from that reality. He is that reality. We can feel it for a moment, and I'm sure we all have had that experience that came from the Rumi poem of being out in that field away from right and wrong at some time or times of our life, and it's beautiful and wonderful. But then we slip back into a world of conditions, a world of ups and downs and rights and wrongs and vices and virtues. So this next phrase is very telling. The trackless one has become free, and no defilements remain to be conquered. So this word defilements in Pali is asa, and that actually means desire. But Sangharakshita chose to translate it as defilements because he wanted to show this yearning and this wanting that never ends, that there's a yearning and a desire that can never be filled, that once it's been filled by one thing, then you want another and another. So he uses this word defilements, and defilements are negative effects on something that is in itself pure or has the potential to be pure. To defile is to bring down or to dirty, but it's not a natural state of being. And it's interesting because in the book, there's also a chapter that's called stains. And stains are the same thing. A stain comes on a cloth later. It's not part of the cloth originally. And there's a very nice little verse about that. The person of understanding removes their stains gradually, little by little, and from moment to moment, just as the silversmith removes the impurities of silver. And in those days long ago, to do that, to remove the impurities from metal, was a lot of work. You heated it at a high temperature and then you filtered it. And then you heated it again and then you filtered it again. It was a process, a repetitive process. And so this verse is about, it's kind of like an alchemical description of what it's like to work for spiritual development, to continually be working to purify, and then again, and then again. It's not something that happens right away. And now I'm going to read you the second verse. That enlightened one in whom there is not that ensnaring, entangling craving to lead anywhere in conditioned existence, and whose sphere is endless. By what track will you lead him astray? The trackless one. And in this verse, craving is another word, and Sangharakshita speaks of this word. It's tanha, and that means thirst. That means the need, the thirst for something that you have to have. You have to have water if you're thirsty. You can't give that up. And it's kind of interesting, this thing of thirst, because when you look in wild places like Africa or Australia, and where the water holes are, where the water is, are all the tracks of the animals, because the animals all need water. They can't live without water. So their tracks are particularly apparent around the water. And that's where you can trap them. That's where you can catch them, because they have this need for water, and so you can get them there. So now I'm going to start talking about tracks in my life and also in the world. So the track I'm going to talk about is one that's kind of clearly defined and still going on a little bit in my life. And so that's why I think I'll talk about it, though of course there are many, many tracks in my life and in all our lives. And those are tracks of craving, really, and the tracks that hold us in this conditioned world. So the first time I saw this addiction, really, and habit, was when I was 15, and we'd moved countries twice in 2 years. And so I was insecure, and I was in a new school with new friends that I didn't know, new classmates that weren't friends. And my mother was not happy because she had left the Philippines where she'd always been, and she didn't have servants to help her, and life was difficult for her. So I was helping my mother a lot and attached to that. And I developed a need to eat. I had my tracks that went to the refrigerator, and I was an overeater, a kind of a bit of a binge eater for some years. And it was hard and it was humiliating because my mother was always putting me on diets, and she really couldn't bear overweight. And so I would steal food and take it to my room and eat. And it didn't really start to go away until I went to university, and then I made friends and I went out into the world. And so it started to go away. But that track did remain kind of for 10 years. And I remember the day that actually I completely finished with that track. And I was 25 years old, and I was doing my master's in landscape architecture. And I'd eaten a tremendous a lot this night before a class, which was a plant walk. And that was my favorite, looking at the plants. And so we were walking along to look at the plants, and I had a full belly, and I kept kind of dragging back. And I also had gas, so I kept wading back a little bit, then going forward and listening to what was going on. And I kept missing the Latin names for the plants, and I love that, and missing seeing the seeds and the flowers. And so I just said to myself that day, well, I can't continue this. I can't continue eating like this and be a landscape architect. And it just left. It wasn't there anymore. But it doesn't mean the track wasn't there, because there was still a great weakness in me for substances that were illegal, and also for cigarettes and alcohol and things like that. And 30 years later, that track came back into big time appearance when my mother came to live with us after my father died. And I was 55, not 25, when that whole thing ended, or 15. And I was her major carer, and I wanted to do that, but I moved right back into my old thing of taking care of my mother and giving up everything for my mother. And I needed the comfort, I guess, that I'd been used to giving myself in that old way. And so my tracks to the refrigerator, they came back. But they were for alcohol, not for food. And when I would come back from my mom's home, she just lived like 2 buildings down from me. And I would just walk automatically to the fridge and get my bottle of wine and have 1/2 to 3/4 of a bottle of wine every night. And one night I decided to celebrate looking at the French Film Festival, streaming it on my computer, which I learned to do for the first time in my life, when the French Film Festival was free through Digiturk, and I could see these French movies with English subtitles. So I started making gin and tonics and just looking at French movies all night. And I was having a great time, and I was drinking a lot of gin and tonics. And it was February, this time. And I got up to go somewhere to get something or go to the loo, and I had a blanket around me. And I was walking down my hall, and I tripped over the blanket. And my body was just not, very, it was a bit drunk, it was a bit loose. And I flipped on my back. I just flipped, and the back of my head hit the paved corridor of my apartment, and it smashed down, and I could see stars. And I was lying there, and I put my hand back to see if I had blood, and there was no blood. And I thought, this is really a low point of my life. Here I am lying here, and I could have hit my head on this cupboard next to me and died, and then they'd find me, this 55-year-old woman with a gin bottle and no life of her own, and just dead in the hallway. And it really got to me. And so I made moves pretty quickly right away. And I got a lale card with Istanbul Kultursanat. And I started going to the movies, the movie festivals. And I started going to Agherini and to the jazz festival. And I started feeling part of the city. And I made a very good friend, an artist, a young American artist. And we would draw together. And then I knew I needed to move on into meditation. I knew I needed it. I had done it in my past, but I needed a teacher. And I found a teacher. I found him, and then I lost him. I met him, and then I lost his number, and I thought, oh, I've lost him. And then I found it again on the computer by some serendipity. And I came back here. I came here to this center, and I started studying meditation, which was really very, very good for me. And my life feels very changed. Those tracks, those cravings are not on the track, but the tracks is still there. And I just discovered it recently. And that was in this thing of caring for my mother and doing everything for her. There was a woman here for a while, and I was helping her out. And I care for her a lot and respect her a lot. But I just moved right into taking care of my mother. I stopped kind of acting like myself. I stopped being flexible. It was like I was just doing everything for her, and I wasn't it had to be this way, and I could see myself like that. And if I didn't do what she wanted, then I was scared and frightened like a child that might get in trouble. And I woke up at 4 a.m, and I was thinking about it, and I thought, this is a track, because I was actually studying these trackless verses. And I thought, this is a track. And I could see myself on the track. And I said, it's a track of my taking care of my mother. And I can get off it. And I watched myself. I stepped off the track, and I walked into the forest. And when I walked into the forest in my mind, everything was open. There was no... there was nothing that was decided for me. Everything was for me to do in relation to this woman with the forest, with the world. I was interacting with the world. I wasn't going down a track that was automatic. And I think that's one of the things about habits and addictions. They're a very simple way for our mind to deal with life. We've decided, okay, that's the way, that's the solution, and there's no thought about it anymore. And when you get off it, there's an ultimate amount of options. And it really worked for me that day. I saw her later, and I was just very different with her. I was loving, I was there, but I wasn't doing this inflexible thing that I was doing before. And I was able to actually refuse something that I didn't want to do, but in a loving way. And it was just very different when I had seen that. So I think that it's quite important to see these structures and realize how they work. They're not only personal, they're also the structures of our human species on this earth. And so I'm going to move from that. Wait a minute. I just want to say one little verse that was me in the hall when I'd fallen down. I just love this verse. Be delighters in the non-heedless. Keep watch over your mind. Lift yourself clear of the difficult road of mental defilements, as an elephant sunk in a bog hauls himself out. And I really felt that, that I was sunk in a bog. I think that the descriptions and the help that this little book gives is quite amazing. Okay, so now we're going to move to the karmic effects of us as a species on this earth. And there's a word called the carbon footprint. So that's another mark, and that's a mark on the earth. And it's a global karmic footprint. It's the karmic effects of human-induced carbon emissions that create heat-trapping gases and global warming, which is superimposed on our natural climate. So that's, again, like the stain and the defilement. It's superimposed on a natural varying climate of the earth. And we can see it now with our own eyes. It's pretty easy to see the effects around us, but I'm going to read some of the effects. The growing season has lengthened. Spring comes earlier and autumn later. There are more droughts, heat waves, fires, even in Scandinavia up in the north. The sea levels are rising. Oceans are getting hotter and more acidic. Natural habitats have become hostile to wildlife. And I was doing some research, and I saw that in October 2018, a study by WWF, using many scientists, came out with the result that since 1970, 60% of our wildlife has been lost, has gone extinct. And that was a real shock to me, because 60% is over the tipping point. It's over 50%. And that means exponentially it goes faster and faster. So that was really a shock. And also, human life and prosperity suffers because agricultural lands get less, and there's more migration from places like Africa and the Middle East of people looking for lands where they can live. And there's more war, as has happened in Syria. So there are a couple more verses from the Dhammapada that touch this. Attended upon by craving, the race of men run about in terror, like a trapped hare, fettered and bound as they are. Suffering befalls them again and again for a long time. So it's about this very kind of difficult situation of being stuck in craving. And the verse as Sangharachita, I thought you were giving me a time thing. Okay. Sangharachita describes this entangling craving. He tells the Pali word for it, which is jalini, which means a net or a trap. So it's a trap. The craving traps us. And like a net or a trap, the more you try to get out, the more stuck you are in it. And so it's very important to be aware of that situation and how it works in a karmic way. At the same time, the Buddha, the Enlightened One, is victorious. And there are many attempts to be free and many